thought that what I would do is, first of all, begin to describe a short project that I was involved in looking at the landscape of citizen science, and then to use that as a framework for talking about the work that I've been doing on ladybirds. So it's just my name that's appearing on this title slide, but that's really far from representing the collaborative effort that goes into all of these projects. And I will at the end thank all the volunteer recorders, but I want to particularly at this stage mention some of my colleagues, Michael Pocock, Nick Isaac, and also Richard Comont, who've had a major part to play in the work that I'm going to be describing. So I am based within the Biological Record Centre, which is part of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and in the Biological Record Centre I lead the zoological side of things. It's a really exciting place to work because we've heard this morning about these large distribution data sets that we get to play around with, and in the United Kingdom we have about 80 to 90 million observations that we can use. So in my professional role, I'm leading the zoology side of things within the Biological Record Centre, but I also have a volunteer role, and I lead the UK Ladybird Survey with Peter Brown in the United Kingdom. And it's a really great pleasure and privilege to be a volunteer scheme organiser, and I enjoy it immensely. And partly what I enjoy immensely is working with so many different other volunteers. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the Ladybird Survey as we go through. We've heard briefly this morning about defining citizen science, and there's a plethora of definitions out there. And I guess in a way that's great because it kind of shows that sort of maverick nature that is citizen science. And I'm going to essentially be using the definition that it's about the volunteer engagement in real science. So to think about a working definition of citizen science, at one end of the spectrum there is excellent engagement, but to me excellent engagement is extremely important, but it's not citizen science. For it to be citizen science, it needs to have some component of real science in it, some kind of data collection, some kind of analysis, interpretation, maybe hypothesis-led, but it's not just the engagement part. But we shouldn't forget that that engagement is really important. Yesterday I visited the Science Museum here on the campus, and there was some fantastic engagement going on there, and that is really important for capturing the imagination of the next generation of scientists and indeed the current generation of scientists. So to me, citizen science is bringing together excellent engagement and real science. And at the bottom here we can see, actually in the red speckled t-shirt, is my daughter getting involved in some citizen science with her very good friend Anna, and they're out recording insects visiting flowers to address a specific question, looking at the insects visiting flowers on crops and in non-crop habitats within agricultural systems. And I think she might say that she did find it quite enjoyable, so I hope it was some excellent engagement, but I won't put her on the spot now. It was certainly some real science, and after we've run the survey again this year, we'll be publishing it in a peer-reviewed publication. So we've seen an explosion of citizen science projects in recent years, but we have to remember that citizen science, although it's a newish term, it's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And some of the records in our Biological Record Centre database date back centuries. To me, that's really exciting. Those people who are making those observations centuries and centuries ago had no idea of how we would be using that data today. And to me, that's just simply inspiring. And the observations that we're collecting today, who knows how they will be used going forward into the future. So just to describe, first of all, this project that we did to look at the landscape of citizen science. It was funded by the UK Environmental Observation Framework. It was a very short project. We just had 4 months, essentially, to do a global review of citizen science. So it was quite challenging, I would say. However, it was a huge amount of fun, and because I have a passion for science communication and citizen science, it did give me an opportunity to really take a close look at many different citizen science projects, and indeed to criticise my own citizen science projects. I learned a lot about what I was doing wrong within citizen science, and I'm sure I've got a lot more to learn in that regard going forward. But essentially, Michael Pocock and I, with a team from the Natural History Museum, John Tweddle and Lucy Robinson, we took a semi-systematic review of citizen science projects and we scored them for a whole variety of attributes. And we wanted to essentially look at this diversity of citizen science. So we searched for a variety of standardized search terms. We revealed more than 600 different projects, and we scored 392 of those in a first go at doing this. And we hope that what we've done is create a systematic method that will be repeatable going forward in the future, so we can see how this landscape of citizen science might change. So just to give an idea of some of the scoring that we used, we looked at the project protocols, whether a person had to select their own site or whether they needed specialized equipment, how complex was that protocol, will it take a very long time to undertake that particular protocol, how many questions need answering, what kind of information is needed, whether it's presence, scores, counts, etc. What kind of information was provided, what sort of background information and how clear were the aims of the project. How could someone take part? Was it via postal mail or websites or smartphones? Was there support provided in the way of training, supporting material on the website and other resources? And then, are the data available to be shared by everyone at the end, either as download or as particular viewing summaries? So we put all of this data, initially Michael Pocock did the vast majority of the analysis work, into a multiple factor analysis to look at the landscape of citizen science. And we're extremely excited. We thought, this is it. We're going to see some clustering of citizen science projects, and we'll be able to define those clusters, and this is really going to be earth-shattering science or nature type work. But that essentially was our landscape of citizen science. So after initially we looked at it and thought, gosh, that's a little bit different to how we imagined. We then thought, actually, that's really quite amazing. That does just show the sheer diversity of citizen science. There is no clustering. There are no discrete types of projects. We just have this amazing landscape of anything that goes. So, of course, with all of these things, you then try and put some kind of description onto those axes to try and add some order to the chaos, which we're going to hear a lot more about later on this afternoon from the distribution data perspective. And essentially, what we can see on these different axes is that we have a spectrum from scientific sampling through to the more mass participation, ad hoc distribution type approaches. And then in the other way, we have very basic type protocols through to more elaborate type of protocols and more elaborate projects with more resources, for example, providing more background and supporting information, etc. So then if we start to place some of the projects and some of the initiatives onto this landscape, we can begin to see where some things sit. So Evolution Megalab, which is a project that Jonathan was involved with, indeed led, I believe, from the OU, sits within the elaborate end, but it is a mass participation project. Many, many people got involved. Our BRC type data from our schemes and societies, of which we have about 80 different schemes and societies, sits over towards the scientific sampling and the more basic end, in terms of the basic part being that it is about collecting presence data. But it's more elaborate because of the sheer need for the taxonomic identification and that the expertise that is required for many of the different species that are recorded in that way. So I'm going to come on to the Ladybird survey in quite a bit of detail later on, but just so you can see where it sits within this landscape. And it would sit down with the BRC schemes and societies. It is a BRC scheme and society. However, it moves up into this top corner because we had one particular part of it that was very much hypothesis-led, and so it became a little bit more elaborate. So that's why it's part of the UK Ladybird shifts within this spectrum towards the elaborate mass participation end of this graph. So Michael has been looking at this landscape of citizen science in a whole variety of different ways, and I'm not going to present all of his different results that he's been doing, but I just thought it would be interesting to show you this one particular way in which, if we look at the different types of citizen science, and these have been defined quite well now by Bonnie et al. And the team, whereby we know that most citizen science has been about contributory citizen science. These mass participation surveys where essentially people are out there gathering the data, and then there's some scientists behind the scenes who are doing the analysis and interpretation. And so the vast majority of the projects that we looked at fall into that contributory category. And there's far fewer that fall within that co-created and collaborative type approaches, whereby really the citizen scientists are posing the questions and really getting involved in the analysis and interpretation and all aspects of the project. So when we look at that, the few of them that there are mainly of the biological recording schemes. So for example, we have one particular group of recording schemes in the United Kingdom called the Riverflies recording schemes. And essentially they run the whole thing themselves, and it's very much driven by the volunteers and led by the volunteers. So we can see that there's been some kind of evolution of citizen science over time, and if we were to add some kind of time scale to this landscape of citizen science, we can see that there has been this movement around the graph, if you like, ending up over towards this part of the landscape. And we would like to suggest that that's to do with the evolution of citizen science, and the rapid expansion in citizen science has been in part driven by the variety of new technologies that we can use, and we saw such fantastic examples of this morning. And if you like, there's been some kind of adaptive radiation in citizen science, and that adaptive radiation has been driven by technology, is what we would pose. So from this elaborate analysis that we did, we thought it would be really useful not just to have this several hundred-page review, which there is available on the internet if you wish to download it, but we thought it might be really useful to distill some of what we found out through that review into a guide to citizen science. And so working with our colleagues at the Natural History Museum, we developed this guide, which you can download. If you wish to have a hard copy, you can just let me know and I can try and find you one to post. They've been really well sought after, which has been great. So we don't have very many left, but it is downloadable from the internet. And when we wrote this guide, it was very much a starting point. We really expected it to be, and we hope it still will be, a working document for people that people elaborate on and that they add to, and indeed that they criticise and that they think of ways in which it could be improved. So far, we've received very positive comments about it. And it might seem that some of what we say in it is very much about sort of statements of the obvious, but certainly from my perspective, being involved in this project, yeah, some of the things are very intuitive and obvious, but they weren't intuitive and obvious when I was setting up some of the projects that I've been setting up, so it has actually been very useful guidance. So one of the things that we developed, I'm just going to take a quick look at the time, I'm doing okay, is a framework for citizen science, a kind of flowchart, if you like, to follow to set up a citizen science project. And I just thought I'd take you through that framework with a few examples, and then move on to very specific examples in relation to the Ladybird survey. So one of the most important things for a citizen science project can be to define the project aims. And one of the things I learned was that when we launched in 2005, following the arrival of the Harlequin ladybird, Harmonia axyridis, in the United Kingdom, the Harlequin ladybird survey, I realised we didn't have clear aims at all. We just said to people, tell us about the Harlequin ladybirds that you see. We got inundated with Harlequin ladybird records, which was fantastic. We hadn't told anybody why we wanted to tell us about the Harlequin ladybird. And so not surprisingly, my phone and my email was inundated with people saying, okay, so we found it, what do we do about it? And then for me to say, well, no, we don't want you to do anything about it, I just want to know where you've seen it because I want to use it in my scientific research, seemed a little bit weak. And I think actually I should have been very much more clear about the way in which I was gathering their data to begin to look at, there was nothing we could do about it, and I should have been very clear about that and the way in which we were going to use this to look at the Harlequin ladybird as a model invasive alien species. And indeed that's what we've done, but we didn't tell people that's what we were doing. So one of the projects I'm involved with this year is the Big Bumblebee Discovery, and this is a collaboration with the British Science Association and EDF Energy. And we're going to be asking school children particularly, but anyone can get involved, to watch the bumblebees categorised them into distinct colour groups that are visiting lavender plants all across the country. We've got a very specific question. We want the children to look at the question about, so how is the landscape affecting the diversity of the bumblebees that they're seeing visiting their lavender? So I hope with this project we have been very explicit in our aims. And certainly because of working with the British Science Association and EDF Energy, we have some amazing resources that are going alongside this project. So it's something I'm very excited about for this year. It's important to identify and understand the target participants. Sometimes you might be trying to appeal to everyone within a particular country or region. Other times you may be specifically targeting school children, or maybe a different age category, or a particular club, or ramblers, or anglers, or whoever they might be. But having some understanding of those people and your participants can really help in shaping the citizen science project going forward. It's important to have a good design of the scheme, and the UK Ladybird Survey is very much in many ways just a standard biological recording scheme, but we have worked really hard in terms of both the online resources and the online recording form to ensure that it does meet the needs of the participants. One of the really interesting things is that we changed the online recording form very recently, and it was at this point that I realised that I'm not really leading the UK Ladybird Survey. There are many people involved in the UK Ladybird Survey, and there were complaints about the fact that I hadn't warned people that we were changing the recording form. And it was at that point I realised I had to be much more thinking about the community and not just making changes like that. So actually I put up the old form as well, so then they had the choice. I tried to say, please use the new form, but if you're really comfortable with the old form still, we can manage. And our new form is based within the iRecord system. And many people ask about iRecord and what's the difference between iRecord and iSpot. Well, iSpot is very much about identification, and iRecord is very much about capturing records and sharing records. However, we can see from what Jonathan said earlier that there are also records contained within iSpot, and also within iRecord there is some identification help, because, for example, when I verify a ladybird record, if someone has got the identification wrong, I will give them some clues and hints as to what it is that is the problem with the species identification they have come up with versus the correct species identification. But we are talking a lot with iSpot, and as we heard from Jonathan, that they share the data from iSpot with the schemes and societies, so we have iSpot records within the UK Ladybird Survey, and we're talking about different ways in which we can link between the two different systems. But I find iRecord a really effective way for running the Ladybird Survey and capturing the records. And we've made our form quite bespoke because I wanted to gather information on colour form as well as life stage. It's important to promote and publicise the work. We're very lucky with the ladybirds because they do get a lot of publicity themselves. They are their own PR because people just love ladybirds in the same way as they love butterflies and birds. And so they get a lot of publicity. So, for example, this article that was in the newspaper on the 18th of April 2014, we didn't put out a press release. We just got a mention within this article because of the ladybirds appearing and waking up for spring. But it's also important to get out and talk to people, and Peter Brown and I, and also Richard Comont and the Ladybird Survey, do give an awful lot of talks and run workshops for identification and really try and promote the survey face to face. We've worked with other organisations, such as the BBC Breathing Places, to produce resources that we can do alone. I'm not an education expert, I'm a scientist, and I don't really have a very good understanding of what appeals to children. But the BBC do have a good idea through their education department, and by working with them, we're able to put together some really lovely resources. And that encouraged, for example, Imogen, who is a teenager who is recording ladybirds. She's got her parents recording ladybirds and her grandparents recording ladybirds. And she told me she wishes that all science could be about ladybirds. And she's turned her GCSE artwork into ladybirds. So I'm absolutely delighted, and I hear from Imogen quite a lot. And it's just fantastic to think that that next generation of scientists and recorders are coming through. I think Imogen will be running the survey before too long. It's also important to provide feedback, and hopefully I do that a lot through the iRecord system and through answering people's emails, but I have found Twitter to be fantastic too. So I was a real Twitter cynic, and then I heard somebody talking about its value for natural history, and I thought, okay, I'll put the ladybirds onto Twitter, and pretty much all I tweet about is ladybirds. So it's not me that has 2,568 followers, it is the ladybirds. They do all the publicity themselves, and I just love it. I love hearing about what other people are seeing, and I love being able to tell people, look, this is what came into iRecord today, or somebody spotted an orange ladybird, how about looking out for orange ladybirds? It's just really great. And we get the most amazing pictures coming through on Twitter. It's important to share the data, and our UK Ladybird Survey data gets fed up to the National Biodiversity Network Gateway, all of the verified records only we send, and but people can access it through iRecord as it's coming in as well if they're registered onto the system. Again, within iRecord, we get the most stunning pictures. I just love this picture because of this little collection of different species in this tiny hole on this concrete post. I don't think the Jennifer Lewington, who recorded this, could quite appreciate how excited I was by seeing that picture, but I just think there's something very beautiful about it. It's important to review and adapt the system, and the Ladybird Survey has recently brought out an app. We also now have iRecord butterflies, and soon we'll have iRecord grasshoppers and crickets coming through. And the app has been really opened up the survey to another tranche of people who weren't involved before, and we have a field guide essentially within that app as well. But it's important to make use of that data. It's important to analyse, interpret and publish it. And we produced the first Atlas of Ladybirds, and I have a copy here, and anybody who wishes first one down to take it can have it, or otherwise I'll leave it there anyway. Again, it was just really exciting to be able to celebrate people's records through the publication of the Atlas. And our plan will be to do the same again in about 5 years after this first publication, so that'll be about 2016, and to reanalyse distribution trends and see where there have been changes over time. So I don't know how, have I got 5 minutes?
Yeah, just over 5.
Oh, brilliant. Well, then I can just talk about ladybirds for just over 5 minutes. So, Oni, you'll have to be very strict, yeah, because I'm now going into my zone. But so when I think about the Ladybird Survey and the data that we've gathered, well, there are some really lovely stories that we can tell through that ladybird data. We can show, for example, with this little orange ladybird, Halesia, this expansion of it. It was thought to be an ancient woodland specialist, and we can see with a little speckling of black dots on this map, there was this massive expansion as it began to shift in its host range as a mildew feeder. And suddenly we saw this explosion in orange ladybirds occurring everywhere, a stunning species. And we wouldn't have seen this story in action had it not been for people out there on the ground gathering and sending in these records. We also get the little tiny ladybirds that are just as charismatic as their big relatives. And I really love this record of Clitostethes arcuatus that was gathered from a Malays chap by one of our volunteers, Tim Newton. And as if there wasn't enough that he had found this little beast, he then went on to find Stothoris punctillum. If you were to draw a little pencil dot in front of you, you would have drawn quite an accurate representation of Stothoris punctillum. That is it. It is a tiny, tiny little speck, and it just delights me that our volunteers find these tiny little specks. One of our volunteers, he's a gardener, and he finds them crawling up the inside of the lids of dustbins when he puts the grass clippings into the dustbin, and he records all the ladybirds coming out of the grass clippings. I mean, it's just delightful. And then I have my exciting find of last year, the first county record for Oxfordshire of this ladybird, Scymnus interruptus. I was looking for Harmonia axyridis, I found Scymnus interruptus, I was delighted. And it showed to me as well that we think of ladybirds perhaps as being quite a well-studied group, but we still have so much to find out, and that I can make a first county record of a ladybird is really quite amazing. Then this lady, for example, she sent me a record, and she had no idea the significance of her record, but she said she was picking raspberries in her garden and she spotted this particular ladybird. This is a 5-spot ladybird, a real rarity in Britain. It's confined to disturbed river shingle, but she found it on the raspberries in her garden, admittedly quite near a river, but nevertheless a lovely find. We do get a lot of harlequin ladybird records and very large aggregations of them, such as this one, and often in church towers. And Harmonia axyridis has really driven its own story within the UK Ladybird Survey. And in 2004, Professor Mike Maduris, who was running the survey at the time, and I think that's a really important thing to note as well, that us new scheme organisers, we stand on the shoulders of these giants who have led the schemes for decades and decades before us, and we get the benefits of using the data that they have gathered and archived for us over those many, many years. And Mike Maduris really was a giant within the ladybird world. And when this ladybird arrived in Britain, he was extremely concerned because of the threat it poses to native biodiversity. It's an Asian ladybird, and it threatens biodiversity because it's a generalist predator and a very voracious predator. So Mike and I launched the online survey, and two of these children in this picture are my daughters when they're a lot younger. But we've done a lot of work with a lot of different people to promote the Ladybird survey and online recording. And just for the Harlequin ladybird alone, we have more than 50,000 records received by the UK Ladybird Survey. 50,000 records for one species. And many of these people are only sometimes recording one record. So in terms of numbers of recorders involved, we probably have 20 to 30,000 recorders in the database. I haven't had time to work it out, but it's an awful lot of people sending in their records. And it's allowed us to plot the spread of the Harlequin ladybird and showing this spread going from the east of the country to the west and up to the north, with some limited, something limiting the distribution through into the north. But nevertheless, a great data set for us to explore. One of the ways we've explored it is to look at declines in native ladybirds. So from the data that we have, we looked at 8 species of native ladybird for which we have very, very good data. And we were able to show that 7 out of 8 of the species in Britain are declining in response to the Harlequin ladybird. In some ways, what we were able to do was divide up the United Kingdom into lots of 1 kilometre squares. We had lots of 1 kilometre experimental arenas, if you like, some with the Harlequin and some without. And by comparing over time the occurrence of the other species in those squares, we were able to do this analysis. This analysis was very much taken forward by Nick Isaac and some colleagues in Belgium. We worked also with the Belgian data set. And the one just to show you at the top that we're most concerned about, Adalia bipunctata, the 2-spot ladybird. And in Britain, if you look at the black line, the solid black line is without the Harlequin ladybird and was really doing okay. With the Harlequin ladybird present in the squares, we see a 44% decline in the distribution of that species. So we've able to publish this data in Diversity and Distributions a few years ago, and I just thought I'd give you a few sound bites of some of the other publications that we've got from this data, and particularly from my PhD student, Richard Comond. For example, he was then able to look at building from this data set and looking at the distribution trends to take in some other factors in terms of looking at some traits of the ladybirds, but also bringing in climate and habitat factors as well. And he then looked at all of these different factors and how they drive local extinction and colonisation in the British ladybirds. And that paper was just out at the end of last year. I won't go into any details, I just want to show you the way in which we've been able to use this amazingly chaotic but rich data set. We were also interested to use the colour pattern data, and I was interested, is one of the colour patterns spreading better than the other, for example? I might expect that the dark colour pattern with thermal warming might have some advantage at the invasion's front. That was my hypothesis. Actually, there wasn't a great deal of difference, but nevertheless, it was a lovely project for a master's student to explore the data set. And this is almost in press, which has got some minor revisions to deal with, and then it should be in press later on this year. And we did show that the colour morph, which is the pale orange colour morph, does seem to benefit from increased sunshine. So there was maybe a little hint of some sort of thermal warming aspect going on. We've also been looking at whether habitat preferences have changed since the arrival of the Harlequin ladybird, and this is something we're just writing up at the moment, but we have shown that some of the species, particularly, for example, the 2-spot ladybird, has retracted its range quite dramatically. We've also been looking at the natural enemies and taking a community perspective. And in terms of a failure of citizen science, well, when we first launched the parasite survey, I thought, who won't want to collect ladybird pupae and put them in yogurt pots in their kitchen and look at the emergence of parasites? I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? Well, apparently lots of the British population do not want to do that. And so we only had a really small amount of data that came through. But nevertheless, it was enough data for us to look at the natural enemies of the ladybirds, and we have a paper out in Insect Conservation and Diversity using this data set and showing that Harmonia axyridis is not affected as much as 7-spot ladybirds. And I'll just finish by saying this all might seem very academic in terms of the Harlequin ladybird perspective, but actually we've been able to use this system to inform our surveillance and monitoring of alien species within the United Kingdom. And we are running an alien alert system based on the Harlequin ladybird model. Citizen science and citizen scientists come in many, many different guises, but the value of them is just immeasurable and unquestionable. And my life is enriched by working with many, many different volunteers and using their data in many, many different ways. And one of the challenges I'm really looking forward to taking on going forward is to work more with the volunteer community in more aspects of the science approach. So with that, I will just acknowledge all of those many volunteers and the coordinating organisations that I've had the pleasure to work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think we have to move on to the next one.
Okay.
So the final presentation before discussion is Michelle Borngren, who's going to talk about phenological data and involving citizens in thinking about climate change.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Michelle. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor, of course. I'm not here, or I am here representing a couple of agencies that are now involved in the National Phenology Network that I'm coordinating. I myself is hired by the Agriculture University, but we collaborate since a couple of years with these the Swedish governmental agencies and universities. I wouldn't have been here without my fellow coordinators, Ola Langvall at the Agriculture University, and Åslaug Dahl, who's been working on pollen monitoring in Sweden for probably 30 years or something. And they helped me a lot and have been doing so for the last 5 years. I put the title Turning Passion into Practice, and I must say thank you to Helen for introducing the volunteers so well. I think it's really a pleasure, privilege, I would say, to work with volunteers in this way. We call them amateurs sometimes, and if I'm right, the word amateur says something you love, when you do what you love, amore. And that's actually what's inspiring to see, right? You start off with something you, as a scientist, and you realize that people really want to do this. They really love it, and they want to do it on their spare time, and they want to help us. So thank you very much for all the volunteers, of course, to all the volunteers that helped me along this way, and they are the reason why I'm here. So my background is an evolutionary ecologist. I worked on the glossy buckthorn for 6 years. I was especially interested in the phenology of that plant. I don't know if you know the plant. It's one of these common but inconspicuous shrubs in Swedish landscape. Often eradicated by farmers because it's hosting a wheat rust. But when you study phenology closely, you realize a lot of things. The flowering season for this plant covers about a month. The fruiting season comes after about another month and have a similar modal shape, right, like that. And I tried during this PhD work to analyze the different benefits of the different parts of the season. And you realize easily how complex that is. Phenology, we often focus on the start of something, first spring flower, first leafing, or something like that. But when you work on phenology like this, you realize it's a really complex system, right? So when you've done this for 6 years, perhaps you start loving phenology, I don't know, but you certainly start questioning if anybody else is interested in phenology. I mean, it's hard to explain to somebody that you spent 6 years working on a plant in this way, right? You're all researchers here, or many of you are. I'm sure you have similar experience, right? So what happened then when I was about to finish my PhD thesis, I started worrying what to do next. And a colleague of mine came in with this paper article from Uppsala Nya Tidning to the right here. It says Gunnar, well, in English. Gunnar knows all about the weather. He'd been checking weather, or he'd been recording weather for more than 60 years, right? 67 years, which is a common thing among farmers, right? They often write down these things in their notebooks and keep checking that. The fun thing is that in the far right corner there, it says that he also recorded spring flowers. And it turned out that he recorded first sightings, first flowering times for 73 years of about 25 species in and outside his garden. And I was lucky enough to get that data eventually and to work on that. and I'm pretty sure it's a world record. So it's something we're really proud of. It's ended up in Nature. It's ended up in different kind of papers now. So thanks a lot, Gunnar. You're the reason why I'm here. But Sweden has a long tradition. Linnaeus is considered the father of phenology in the sense that he and his student set up the first phenology network anywhere. So he actually put a formal monitoring protocol in 1750. It ran for 2-3 years, 20 stations in Sweden, and they collected data. Really bad data, I think. But it still was something that he is honored for nowadays as well. About this time also, I happened to read a footnote in the classical book Pflanzenphenologie, Fritz Schnelle, about a publication in Sweden which said the seasonal vegetation in Sweden, published in 1923. And I went to the library, found the book, and it was pages and pages and pages with tables. Mean flowering times, mean ripening times, whatever, agriculture, birds, whatever. And thanks to the good Swedish archive tradition, we've now found all these records. So they are all scanned in now, all digitized, and it's about 350,000 observations. We just submitted the first bird phenology paper on this. We've done a couple of plant-oriented studies as well on this one. And it's an amazing reference data set for us, right? And the interesting thing here is that this is citizen science data, right? This was volunteers at 700 sites in Sweden, sending in this during a 50-year-long period in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So it's really inspiring also for the volunteers today. Look what we can do with this historical data. We will be able to do the same with your data today, right? So obviously, when you start looking at data like this, and we live in the era of a changing climate, you are not surprised as a scientist anymore to see this kind of graphs. During the last 20 years, it's been published a lot of papers like this showing some kind of trend, early flowering for spring flowers or something like that. And this is a moving average, 10-year moving average representation of Gunnar's data. I've used two famous Swedish plants, bird cherry and lilac, because we have a saying in Sweden, mellan hägg och syren. That's become about a week earlier now during the last 50 years or something like that. So it's easy to communicate, right? It's easy to talk about this. It's easy for journalists or anybody else to understand this. And this has become part of our message when we talk about it. The interesting thing is that such easy change, such trivial changes, I should call them, such changes that we expect. I mean, an early spring like this, which by the way is extremely early, we all expect plants to come earlier, right? That's trivial. But they have fundamental effects. So if the growing season changes, the growing season is a fundamental ecological or ecosystem property, right, for any spot in the world. And it affects many, many things, all from agriculture and forestry, biodiversity, will affect the biomass, I mean, food resources for insects, herbivores, for elks, whatever. How much the wood grows each season for the farmers and so on. It also affects the carbon dioxide, water vapor net effects, right? The biosphere, atmosphere interaction. So researchers here at the university actually wants our phenology data to be better at predicting the changes on the gas exchange, biosphere, atmosphere, gas exchange. It also affects the situation for human health in the way that pollen allergy is a big thing. The season, the phenology of pollen is a big thing for pollen allergies. So they are interested in knowing both the situation now and how that's going to change. So we do have a long tradition, both in agriculture and forestry, to predict phenology. We have pretty good models, locally calibrated models, that allow us to predict when a plant starts to flower. We can do it with 2-3 days locally, right? Temperature sun models, you might know about them. The interesting thing is that when you want to scale them up, if you want to take that locally calibrated model and make it into a Swedish model, we fail. And that's often what ecosystem modelers want to do, right? We also took a data set where we looked at experimental data. People wanted to predict the future for phenology, so they imitated climate change, basically raising the temperature for the plants or for a plot or something, and followed the phenology for these plots. So they got some kind of, temperature. If you increase the temperature in some way, the flowers start earlier. So they get some kind of regression coefficient for that. Seemed to be pretty easy, right? So we took all these experiments in the world and compared them with the same kind of observation, data from observations. And it turned out that the experiments, the red line here, underestimate the effect of temperature quite a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion going on why that's the case, and in that paper we discuss it as well. But my bottom line here is that it's difficult to imitate climate change. So many things are going on at the same time, and because of that, it's difficult to predict the future as well. So another interesting complication with the phenology is that different species respond differently. If we change the conditions, species are different, right? So they will respond in different ways. And I just take an extreme example here of two common Swedish spring flowers, the blue anemone and tussilago. I forgot the English name now.
Coltsfoot.
Coltsfoot. And as you can see in Gunnar's data, they usually come out at the same time in Sweden. And in the early 90s, we had a couple of early, very mild winters. And it's the blue anemone that responds mostly to that. In our Facebook group, somebody explained to me that's probably because the blue anemone has its winter buds at the soil surface, and the tussilago has it below the soil surface. So could be the reason. I don't know, honestly. So anyway, we do have very obvious changes, very obvious effects of climate change on phenology that has fundamental effects, both on health, economics, and perhaps environmental protection also. We do have complicated effects, at least effects that are difficult to predict, like interactions between species. I mean, it is difficult to predict what's going to happen if somebody changes one week and somebody else depends on that change. We have the famous examples from the Dutch and UK systems with birds and insect larvae and leafing data that's been studied quite a lot. My favorite example is from a friend in Canada. She studied a larvae that eat red alder leaves. So the insect puts their eggs on the branch, and they emerge about the same time as the leafing. So she did a classical climate change experiment, warming them. So the eggs hatched 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks before the leaves. So you would expect a lot of mortality, right? Well, they just starved for 3 weeks, and they were as big as they used to be in summer as well. So it is difficult to predict, right? Simple changes, a complex system, very difficult. And when it becomes difficult, researchers become interested. So I would say a couple of years ago, phenology was kind of a trivial, boring stuff. Yeah, of course, it's changing. And now it's actually gaining attention, and more people in different research disciplines are interested in these changes. These, in a way, trivial, simple changes. So of course I should mention also that we do get attention from the environmental assessment agencies. It is an easy way to communicate effects of climate change to the public. And it's also a fundamental ecosystem property, right? So it's something they are interested now in following. I'm going to mention that a little bit more. But so with this background, we realized that we actually want to collect this kind of data, both for validation purposes, but also for actually tracking. We are bad at modeling this, we are bad at predicting, so we need this kind of data just to make sure that we follow this fundamental property in a good way. And
5 minutes.
okay. So I'm going to rush through here. So we launched our website 2008. We weren't sure if there was any interest. It turned out that there was. And since then, we've built up what we call the National Phenology Network, and the website called naturenskalender.se, naturescalendar.se, inspired by the British and others. And as Helen said, I, from the beginning, thought that if we want to motivate the volunteers, we want to show them that this is professionally interesting, that we as professionals are really working with this, are interested in this. So it's been a strategy of mine to really make sure that the professionals are visible in this system. So early on, we got contacted by the environmental protection agencies, and then after a while, when we had digitized historical data, I started approaching the scientists as well. So apart from me and my, the little small group, that more and more people are now gaining interest in this. And that, I think that was an important strategy. We also very early involved professional field stations as observers. So as a backbone in the system, there are professional observers doing exactly the same observations as the volunteers. Yeah, Helen talked a lot about talking about this, and I'm married to a communications officer or boss or whatever, so she tells me every night what I should do. But one thing I've learned along the way is that you have to stick to your message, right? You need to know what to tell the audience, and it's easy if you can have a few. And I pretty early decided, even though the climate change thing is a controversial thing, even at least in the 2008 it was, I decided to use that as my tool. So climate, spring signs, you can help. That's a good combination of message here, right? And I used that a lot. After a while, we realized that we need to focus on the autumn as well. So autumn signs are as important as spring signs nowadays for me. And we are increasing the observations from that. Obviously, historical data is good for local connectance. We used the smartphone app we thought to be a little bit modern. Obviously, it's a very good thing also. You get attention, but you also get better quality because people can report from the field, right? Yeah, we use this many ways, that's traditional ways nowadays. I mean, both traditional media and social media. I sometimes think of this as the Obama effect, not the Facebook effect, because I was a postdoc when Obama won his election in 2008, and Facebook was very important, right? So, and my wife was a political advisor, so she said, you should do it on Facebook, Shell. And every scientist said, no, we can't be on Facebook, a couple of years ago. So we started Facebook, and now it's a big group for us, and yeah, we use that a lot. I don't have time to blog, unfortunately, I think. But yeah, I try the best. Try to do the best. So there's a couple of concerns with this kind of data. Users of the data, scientists, always ask about the quality. So it was really important for me to work with the quality issues from the start. We decided to do it as a hierarchical level. So professional observers, citizen science observers, anonymous observers. We have a column for that in the database, so to say. So it's easy to separate and double check and check them towards each other and all that. The observers themselves worry about workload. And the interesting thing here is that I've learned from social studies, social sciences, that for motivation, there are three things you should think about: autonomy, purpose, and quality. And the interesting thing is that people get motivated if they feel that they can do checkbox for all these three. They don't get scared off by quality questions. They want to be good. That's what motivates them. So just have to put the right level, but they want to feel that they do good. So I work more and more on quality communication. So how do I communicate quality without scaring off? But you want to use that word because it feels that people are actually doing a good job, and they do the same good job as the professionals. I added community here because and certainly my experience with Facebook is that the community thing is a good thing. You want to be part of something, and that helps, certainly if it's a friendly community. So just to walk through them here, the purpose thing is basically the message I talked about before. I try to tell them that this is important by pumping out the message I have. That's a very different way of showing purpose, and that's becoming visible. So actually being seen on TV, being seen on Facebook and stuff is important. One very important aspect for us has been the fact that we have been developing an environmental assessment indicator together with the agencies. And that's been part of developing the purpose for this, right? But it's also important that when the TV show about spring says something about, willow, that I can go in, get the data from the citizen scientists and show this spring's data, just like that on Twitter, 15 seconds after they talked about it in TV. It's also a way of showing that their data is good quality, so I can go out immediately with that. That serves purpose as well. When it comes to autonomy, I try to make it very convenient. Choose the plants and choose a spot that's convenient. You pass it every day, make it easy for you. I also tell them that we work with reasonable precision. A lot of researchers think that we should measure decimals. I don't think so. We work on a weekly scale. We require observation twice a week to be able to say something about a weekly change. I think that's reasonable. I make sure that they know they're part of a network. We don't rely on you. You're part of a network. You're a volunteer. You can stop if you like. And for quality things then, as I said before, we make sure to separate the different data sources. If you're a professional or not, that shows up in the database. I try to work more and more with picture-based instructions, and obviously try to develop simple and stable applications, both on the web and on the smartphone, and hopefully responsive soon. And I try even to do near real-time support. I'm a lot on Facebook. I'm a lot on email. Yeah, and when it comes to the community then, I try to make sure that the community is friendly and supportive. Like iSpot, we try to answer people's questions as soon as you can. But I'm also very, very concerned with keeping the focus, so that this is a community about nature's calendar, nothing else. Okay, I should say thank you. I perhaps should say one thing about the historical database before I leave, and that's one thing that you have to be aware of. This is the historical database, and for how many years each observer continued. So many, of course, stopped after 1 year, but it turns out that approximately 30% of these guys continued for more than 7 years. 30% continued for more than 7 years. Still, I don't build my analysis, I don't build my system that, requiring that they should continue. I build them as volunteers. You can leave whenever you want. And this is how far we are now compared to this historical data set. So we think that historical data set is good, 350,000 observations in 50 years, we can use it for a lot of stuff. We reach that level, or a reasonable level, even during our first pilot years. So we're hopefully on a good way here. Thank you very much.
Well, now we're going to spend a little bit of time before lunch having a more general discussion. And it's open for members of the public who ask this morning's speakers relevant questions to this morning's presentations. We'll move chairs in the front, so this morning's speakers could come down to the front. And then also, some of the speakers have been very good and sent in advance general questions which could be of interest for the morning discussion. For example, Helen had the question, how do we maximise the sharing of good practice to inspire collection of high-quality data? Arco said, should we give more guidance in the collection of unstructured, opportunistic data? Magne, in a loose translation from Norwegian, is how can we make the species skills more important in the teaching of young people, 6 to 19-year-olds? And Jonathan wondered, how can we involve citizens in setting the research agenda? No, that's mine, sorry. No, Walker's arranged this still. Yeah. So these are questions that, if you guys remember the questions you asked, I've still got them here, that we can come back to, which are obviously of very general interest. But it's open to the public now to bombard these people with interesting general problems or questions.
Well, I have a question addressed to all of you. I'm very impressed by what you all have presented this morning and what is possible. But it also turned out from all of you that you have to invest an incredible amount of time in running these systems and in feedback to the people. And then, but it was also apparent that you have to, the scientific part needs to be in there. But I think we as scientists, we already have schedules that are more than full. So how do we solve this problem that if you want to do your science at a university, you already have more to do than you can handle? But how can we incorporate then citizen science?
It's up to you to decide who answers.
I'll happily say something. I think that it's a really valuable point that as scientists we are incredibly busy people, but I guess I think of myself as both a citizen scientist and a scientist, so my choice is that I use quite a bit of my spare time for the volunteer component of the Ladybird survey, which then happens to feed a little into my research time as well. But there is no doubt about it, it does take a lot of time, and it's not unusual on a Sunday morning for me to be up very early in the morning to be clearing all of the records within iRecord and doing all of the communication that I might have got behind on throughout the week. So I don't think that there is an easy answer to that time side. But I do think that then the value of what I get from that data is absolutely enormous and goes far beyond the time that I put into the project. And I think it's also about working in collaboration, and I think it provides some fantastic opportunities for students as well to get involved with your citizen science projects. And if we're really busy on the survey, then there are people that I can call in to help at various points, and I think they benefit from that as well. And we're never short on people who want to come out to an event or an exhibition or to join me for a talk or something like that. So there's a lot of willingness and a huge enthusiasm for that communication side of things from many scientists.
I also think that you shouldn't do it if you don't approach a question where you need the data as a scientist. It's one thing for me setting up a monitoring system at the same time. I get money for doing that. But for example, last autumn we were invited to do an autumn leaf experiments approach to schools in Sweden. And it turned out that we got 12,000 observations covering Sweden from the southern tip to the northern tip, something you'd never been able to do otherwise. A remote sensing satellite guy here was part of that. A genetic guy studying genetic variation in Aspen at the Umeå University was part of that. They would never have gotten that data if they hadn't done it this way. People sent in aspen leaves with a letter and phenology data to the Umeå guy. You need to approach a question where you want to invest the time. And I would say that nowadays you can link up to other systems. You don't have to start all over. The guide, I'm sure, is very nice to start with, but also Artportalen and other. There are resources today where you can build using APIs, building your own site, making it so much easier than it used to be. Please.
Can I just add to that actually that, I think that's a very good point about the systems. Not only are there systems that we can share and use that other people have built, but also that those systems are getting better and better at helping us as the citizen scientists or the scientists to manage our time more effectively. So for example, within the iRecord system that I use, there's a number of automated rules checks, for instance, that can help me to filter the records so I can look at them in some kind of prioritized way. And then the verification system behind the scenes, the technology is fantastic. So it's very, very quick for me to deal with one Ladybird record, for instance.
I have a general question about the observation process. If you're interested in using this type of data to study change over time, for instance, the observation process per se becomes key to make sure that you are really studying changes in the system rather than changes in the observations. So, one answer would be to set up sort of a validation system, but if you do that, then you can question why you would need the sort of cheap data in the first place. So what would be your response? Would such research agenda be too ambitious?
Jonathan. Helen referred to the Evolution Megalab, which was my first foray into this back in 2009, and we digitized all the data we could find on polymorphism in Cypea nemoralis and Cypea hortensis. So this was a historical sample collected by professionals mainly, and then we recruited 7,000 or 8,000 citizen scientists to gather new data, and we doubled the amount of data available in 1 year. But of course, the way it was gathered in 2009 was completely different to the way the data had been gathered and by whom the data had been gathered in the previous 50 years. So it's a good example of what you're saying. And the way we coped with that basically was, at the end of the day, we looked at the results and we asked ourselves whether they could be accounted for by this effect. So we found that a particular morph had increased over the interval of the thing. And having found it in the citizen science data, we went back to to look at trends in the historical data, and we discovered actually it was there all along, but nobody had seen it. So that's a very particular way of dealing with that issue, and it doesn't. I don't think it generalises to that problem, which is a more general one. But I think you have to be kind of pragmatic, really, and you have to, as far as possible, design the sampling procedure so it's robust to the issues of that are involved with using amateurs. Try and build in checks so that it's possible to clean the data in some way.
So, as the way Helen described before, that the evolution, the adaptive evolution of citizen science, I think what's becoming more common now is also that each system involves different hierarchical levels. So you can involve a lot of citizen scientists at school level, for example, but then you can, within the same system, add protocols where people can decide, I'm really interested in this, I can spend more time with this, so I can follow very specific protocol. And then the other addition is, of course, that it's becoming more and more common to include absent reports. I mean, both for phenologists like me, but also for occurrence data. I mean, it's so easy now. If you're out there with your app, you can say, I checked, it's not here. So it's not as difficult as before. If you already have a protocol, I mean, if you don't have a protocol, it's a different thing. But those who actually follow protocol, yeah, that would help.
Even without a protocol, there's been some really great work that's been done by a colleague of mine, Nick Isaac, in terms of looking at recorder behavior, for instance, and looking at the structure of these distribution data sets. And so, for example, we know that there are some recorders or some recording schemes where there's particular activity in particular regions of a country, so there's quite a heavy geographic bias, for instance. But he's been able to look at these data sets, and along with the schemes and societies, the experts who are leading them, to begin to add some structure and understanding to that bias within the data set. And the ladybird data that I showed you, where we looked at the declines of native species after arrival of Harmonia rex viridis, we used a method of using a well-recorded square. So we only used squares where we had a time sequence of data and a set number of species of data, a set number of species within that square. So we knew it was quite a well-recorded square to take out. So we lost some of our data as a consequence of that. But nevertheless, it did take away some of the bias that you described that is inherent within these data sets.
I have two questions. One connected to the first one. It appears to me that much of this is dependent on very passionate people to start with and to get it running. How do we secure sustainability of this when these people tire out, retire, get sick, whatever, over time? And the other question connected with this is also, how do we secure the data over time? I mean, a lot of this data, historical data, are printed on paper or written on paper in some way. Today, we store everything digitally. How do we secure the use of this data in 100 years?
I guess I'm somewhat motivated by my talk, so I'll start. iSpot was the overarching aim of iSpot, at least it was when it started, was to create a new generation of naturalists. So it actually addresses exactly the point you're making, which is how do you ensure there's continuity of effort, and that's exactly why we exist, or why we started anyway, was to make sure that the knowledge and enthusiasm of the older generations is passed on to the younger generations, and it's actually proving to be quite successful. It's working. As far as the data is concerned, in our case, the data go ultimately to the National Biodiversity Network, which I trust will still be around in 100 years' time.
And the question about saving or ensuring the
Yeah, I can-
persistence of the data.
Yeah, I can say. I mean, I'm pretty new compared to the bird monitoring systems, and I'm pretty new in the system here. But and I've definitely been driven a little bit by passion from my side as well. My feeling is that the governmental agencies are also interested in this now, this kind of data collection, and if the researchers are too, I'm pretty sure that it's going to become a new resource for a country. I mean, I've already suggested to my colleagues that we would actually organize a national council for support, and mostly for communication, supporting these groups. That would be a way to making sure that it's not dependent on single persons, and also making that it develops into the professional level it should be now, because it's been a lot of volunteering here.
Also, in terms of the sustaining the future involvement, having open source software, for instance, and so, for example, again mentioning iRecord, that the Indicia database that's behind iRecord is an online community warehouse, essentially. So there are lots of people who are getting involved with that data set. So you kind of spread the work, and you hopefully bring people on to take on more roles within the verification or the management of the data going forward. So I think that open source development and the idea of the databases being online has been great.
Sven?
Well, as an ecologist, I'm concerned about connecting observation to habitat. I know that in Alberta there are some such, for example, the plants and so on. And I especially want to ask Kjell, can we look at this effect of the urbanization, that the climate is changing in cities and old observations in countryside, so there could be bias there, for example.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the scientific literature in phenology is interested in the urban heat effect. So there's, in that sense, there's an interest in the community. When it comes to our particular data, we haven't analyzed it, we haven't produced a product yet to have to decide that. Obviously, they are all georeferenced. So for the historical data, I don't know if you have good enough maps to actually do the filtering, but I see it as a filtering process, right? So that you consider that. A similar question is about the change of vegetation itself, because that changes the temperature and the growing, the density of the vegetation could affect the local climate, the microclimate, which is much more difficult to control for. On the other hand, it's part of the change. So if we're only interested in phenology, it is still phenology, right? So phenology integrates a lot of changes. If we want to disentangle why, yeah, that's a tricky question.
So we've begun to use the land colour map, for instance, that we hold within the United Kingdom to look at some of the distribution patterns and trends linking to the land colour map. And a couple of the examples I mentioned this morning have used that data. And so, for example, one of them has shown that a combination of the harlequin ladybird and urban areas is particularly detrimental for native species of ladybirds. So we're beginning to think about ways in which we can integrate different data sets.
Large question.
Yeah, I was wondering, we've heard quite a lot about local databases merging into national databases now. I'm curious to hear what you think about national databases merging into global ones. I know that there is, GBIF is around, but if you look at, for example, butterfly data, you soon discover that most butterflies disappear at the Danish-German border and things like that. So, what is your guesstimate of when we will have a useful international database where things are going to start merging?
From the phenomenology community, we have a European collaboration ongoing since the last almost 10 years now. We do have a common database that's based on the same standard code, the same phenological phase code, the BBCH code, which is an agricultural code. But it's still, of course, dependent on the national efforts that's been made over history and presently. So, if you ask about a consistent, equally sampled, my answer is, of course, never.
No, well, more like if you want to be able to work against a database like iRecord or iSpot or Artportal or something like that, both on a European or worldwide level, when do we see that the horizon? Is that in 10 years' time, 2 years' time, 100 years' time, or never?
I think that the ethos for sharing is increasing, or the willingness to share data is increasing and increasing. And I think there has been, in the past, some resistance to sharing data in a big way. The technology is there for people to get the data into GBIF, and I know that, for example, our data sets go to the National Biodiversity Network Gateway and then go straight on to GBIF from there. So from the UK perspective, it's working well, in my opinion. I guess it's just moving other countries into that position, but I guess as well for some countries, they don't necessarily have the national databases at this stage to share. So I guess it's about coming from the bottom up in a way as well, and ensuring that the infrastructure is there within a country to enable them to gather the data and then to share on globally. So it's not going to be a technical limitation, but I guess it's about supporting those countries that don't necessarily have the provisions to do that.
I think the future is open linked data. So rather than trying to put everything into one database, using common standards so that a search can actually find all the data that are relevant to your query wherever they are.
Most bird recording scheme in Europe has web services or APIs to export their data. So it's a matter of time when there are a site that collecting, for example, if you want to see the distribution of a swallow today, you could do that in a couple of years. So someone has to start to collect the data or provide that service.
Okay, we've actually got time now just for the last 3 questions, so 3 people already on the list. So Arko was the first one.
I'm a little divided about what I hear this morning. On the one hand, I hear fantastic stories how you could organize all those volunteers and getting rich data from it. But on the other hand, it's all about collection data. And I feel it could be that you're losing opportunities by focusing so much on just waiting to see what people are going to upload. And I think that there are opportunities to steer them, to guide them. For instance, in your case, about phenology, it's clear beforehand that it's important to make a distinction between urban areas and not urban areas. So why not steering people to urban areas and securing that you have at least a number of sites rather than waiting afterwards and hoping for the best. And I think that's the same sort of examples are relevant for all of you. I think in the case of iSpot, if I may, if you are interested in reporting new species for a country, then I would say, well, make a list of species you may expect and ask observers to be careful and giving quick reports whenever they see them. So that sort of guidance, I think, that would be nice to do for the future. That's my opinion.
Well, my view on this is, first of all, you have to recognise in a project like iSpot, and to some extent the others as well, the most important thing is the number of people using it. There are so many apps on phones that are never used. So if you want to do what you're proposing, there are already mechanisms for doing it using scientists and professional scientists. So the key thing in any project like ours is the number of people doing it, and the more you ask people to do, the bigger the obstacle is. So there's a trade-off between how many people will participate and how demanding the task is. That said, I think there are clever things you can do to bring more of the mass of people into some kind of systematic recording. And we are planning to do this. We have a huge list of things we'd like to do. And one of them is precisely this, because once we've built a really big community, then we can see which the people who are interested in ladybirds, which people are interested in recording a particular type of plant in a particular place, and then we can just automatically notify them that, did you know that this year, the ladybird recording scheme is having a push on this particular species in your area? Why not give it a go? So I think that, yes, you're quite right, we can do it, but it would be easy to undermine the main selling point of our projects, which is the mass, of people involved, by asking too much of them. Just the complexity of a website and the way it increases it can get out of hand if you're not careful. So we have to be careful of that.
I think you can provide something for everyone, actually. And I think you can have the ad hoc data coming in from the mass participation surveys, and you can use the cleverer modelling techniques to make something from that data. And of course you could get even more statistical power if there was more structure or a systematic aspect. And so you can have some people who might be prepared to say, I recorded against this list of ladybirds and I looked for every ladybird while I was there on the site. And that can provide one level of structure. And then you can have another level where some people will go and collect ladybird pupae and see what parasite emerges from it by following a very standardized protocol. So I entirely agree with you that there's ways in which we can get more from the data, and I think that many of us are being quite targeted, as well as allowing for this diversity of people to just get involved and still add some value to the data that they're providing, even if it is just an ad hoc record. It's fantastically valuable, and it adds to a long-term data set that we've had collected in that way for many centuries. And then I think in terms of, for example, with the alien species, we are doing just as you described and having a list of, this is the species that we're expecting to arrive next in Great Britain, be aware of them, and that's this alert system that I mentioned to you. So I think you can have lots of different ways of capturing lots of different people's imagination, and to me it's that diversity that makes citizen science so exciting.
I've also, when I visited researchers or research institutions, I also offer my system as a resource. And I don't make the delimitations or the suggestions which research questions are the important ones. This is a data collection network. And I have certain messages that I try to use to encourage and motivate the user, the observers, right? But hopefully, if we get stable observation networks based on volunteers, we can ask the network, do you want to participate in this particular project for 3 years now? I tried last year and totally failed. Or a researcher at my university asked me if he could ask, and he asked and they totally failed. We are not big enough yet. So I think that the vastness of the network, the number of people that get involved is also resources. It's also a resource. And we want to keep it, we want to increase that also to make it a resource.
I think some of those volunteers will demand a systematic approach as well, and some of them will start to, there's one ladybird recorder who I met via Twitter, and he's his own much more systematic surveys within his own back garden, and
Yeah.
will get other people involved in that as well. So I think as well there are things that come from the volunteer community that aren't necessarily driven by us.
Thomas.
So most of the open access data is actually crowded with different kind of biases, I would say. Partly because of if it's completely voluntary, like the Autonom data, and perhaps like parts of the EI record data as well. So I wonder, have you really explained to the potential users, the guys who actually are going to analyze the data, what kind of possible biases are there in the data? Because I think that's really important, especially if we are talking about authorities like environmental protection agencies and people at different companies and so on. If they want to do quick evaluations of certain areas, they have to know what kind of problems are there in this data, because otherwise it's a real risk it's going to get misused.
So, for example, on the UK perspective, the data that we put onto the NBN gateway goes on with very detailed metadata. And it is the responsibility of the user to look at that metadata. And that metadata will give them all kinds of information about the known quality of that data, for instance. However, it is a concern that there are times when the data users won't be looking at that metadata, and they will just take a whole download of everything that is there. And I'd imagine similarly with GBIF as well. And then these systems get criticized for some low quality data, if you like. But actually it's not the system that is at fault, it's the end user who's not taking a look at the detailed metadata. So yeah, I agree with you entirely. It's important to document the known quality, if you like, of your data. But then it is also a responsibility of the end user to read that metadata and make use of it accordingly.
It's kind of a mutual responsibility,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yes.
You have the knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not so easy as a guy coming from
No,
to understand all
yeah.
the potential biases.
Absolutely.
You have the knowledge.
So absolutely, when this data goes onto the NBN gateway, there is an administrator who that person can get in contact with, and they can ask anything to that administrator about that data set. And I agree, it's important then for the administrator to assist and provide some guidance with respect to that data use. So I do agree entirely, but I think the mechanisms are there and in place. It's up to people to make use of them.
I think we have time for one more question. You had a question.
Yes, I'm not a researcher. I'm Lotte Thomasson from the non-profit organization Vetenskap Allmänhet, public science more or less. And I worked with Kjell in this autumn leave experiment. I just wanted to point out the thing you talked about with the common knowledge of science and getting young people, young generation to take part in this kind of interesting surveys and research. And there is a big opportunity now with the internet, as you said, and also, as Kjell said, you need to cooperate with the marketing to spread the knowledge about it and work with your university communication staff to make it. The more you are known and seen in the public and in newspapers and press, the more interest people are going to get, and schools. That there is also, it's probably a very low level, but if you start a school, you get data and interest that you're going to make work later on and work with. So it's, that's a big thing with it as well, as a non-researcher.
It might be
you need to do a dialogue with them and start to show, of course, what's real research and so on.
It might link to one of the first questions about how to make time for this. I've been extremely helped by I've got a lot of help from the communications department. I mean, at this stage, they're still really nice to us when we show up in media. And coming from university, I get a lot of media attention. And both for packaging the whole project itself, to actually reach out, to formulate the message, so to say, but also actually to getting resources. They are good collaborators. Scientists tend to be a little bit afraid of communications, but they are really helpful if you want to collaborate with them.
Yeah, and we have a fantastic communication team at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology who are really supportive of the work that we do and provide training, for example, in communication, but also working in collaboration with other partners. So, for example, education teams. So, for example, with the project I mentioned with the British Science Association and EDF Energy, it's really great to work with people who have expertise in education, because I don't have that expertise. And I'm learning an awful lot from them in how to translate what I do into something that hopefully makes sense to younger people.
Well, thank you very much. It seems a bit of a shame to break off the discussion, but we now have 1 hour for lunch, so we start again in the afternoon at exactly 13:30 when Lars will be taking over. So can we thank this morning's very good speakers and for a very interesting discussion.